Hello and welcome to our presentation, which is called Let's Never Go There Again. We'll be talking about the textbook access crisis as we experienced it at the University of Guelph and how our library decided to respond to it. First, let us introduce ourselves. I am Heather Martin, the manager of the library's e-learning and reserve services unit, and also the university's copyright officer.
And my name is Meg Ecclestone. I'm a collections librarian at the University of Guelph. And I'd also like to introduce Ali Versluis, who is our current acting head of the research and scholarship team, as well as our former OER librarian. And although she couldn't join us at Charleston this year, she was an invaluable contributor to this presentation. So our agenda for the presentation is we're going to start by giving you a bit of context about our local institution, the University of Guelph Library. And then we're going to walk through the big chronological phases of the pandemic. So we're starting pre-pandemic by looking at some of our existing library efforts to alleviate barriers to textbook access. Then we'll head into the pandemic era and its realities and our response to textbook access issues. And we'll look specifically at our efforts around faculty communications, collaborative workflows, and advocacy efforts. And then we'll look at course materials access today. So what has changed and what hasn't? And we'll wrap up with some conclusions.
So before we talk about the University of Guelph textbook crisis and how we addressed it, we'd like to take a moment to explain a bit about our library's organizational structure, as it was a significant factor in our decision to take the approach that we did. Our model's team-based, which means it tends to be characterized by siloization and specialization of domain expertise. This often presents us with workflow and communication challenges across our teams. But in order to respond effectively to the textbook access problem, we really felt the need to draw on expertise from more than one team and from multiple units within those teams. Our response was coordinated between the research and scholarship team and the collections and content team, the two teams on the left-hand side of this org chart. And it involved the OER librarian, the collection development librarians, and the entire course reserve team. Each of us had different relationships with faculty and provided different types of services to our faculty users. Course reserves and collection development tend to have one-on-one transactional interactions with instructors for the purpose of addressing a specific need, while the OER librarian provides outreach, teaches, and attends departmental meetings, so has a different kind of connection. We recognized very quickly that the magnitude of the issue to be addressed required all of us to be involved in the response, and that it would be unsustainable to funnel all faculty queries through one person or even through one unit. So even prior to the pandemic, the library had made some significant efforts to address the problem of student access to textbooks. In the fall of 2016, we partnered with the University Student Association to survey students about their textbook use and their textbook purchasing behaviors, as well as any other textbook issues that were of concern to them. Our hope was that we might identify ways in which the library could help improve access to textbooks and other course materials. The survey actually received an impressive number of submissions, and in response to the feedback we collected from it, the library launched a number of new initiatives. We implemented a textbook purchasing program, which I will talk more about in a moment. We also made changes to our course reserve lending policies to address some of the concerns that surveys respondents had commented on. These included extending loan periods, implementing overnight loans, and allowing students to take reserve items outside of the library so they could be used in class, at home, or even for an open book exam. A dedicated OER librarian position was established around the same time, and an institutional task force was formed. The task force consisted of members from the library, the Campus Teaching and Learning Center, and the Central Student Association. The role of both the OER librarian and the task force was to raise awareness, promote, and support the use of OER and other types of affordable course content as alternatives to commercial textbooks in order to remove or at least reduce some of the barriers that our students were encountering. The results of our textbook survey were actually eye-opening in a number of ways, but perhaps the most concerning to us were the many ways that the textbook situation was negatively impacting students' university experience. When asked about the impacts of their decision to forego purchasing a required textbook, 83% of them reported at least one negative impact, and many reported multiple negative impacts. The decision not to purchase a textbook was impacting their academic success, their mental health, and their social well-being. This slide lists some of the most frequently mentioned impacts cited by the students in the survey. And these were some of the things that we hoped to help mitigate through initiatives such as the textbook publishing program. The textbook purchasing program was implemented in the fall of 2017, and it was directly in response to the results of our survey. We had heard from students that 60% of them did not purchase all of their required textbooks. When we asked how they managed without purchasing the textbook, 37% said they used a library copy instead if one was available. At the time, the library did not routinely purchase textbooks, instead leaving it up to instructors to place a copy on reserve if they wanted to. But after the survey, we decided to set aside funds to allow us to preemptively acquire and place on course reserve a single copy of the required textbook for most undergraduate courses on campus. Our preferred format was electronic, and we also preferred to get an unlimited user license. But when this was not an option, as was frequently the case, we found out, we purchased whatever was available. We knew, even at the time, that this was not a solution to the textbook problem. A 1 or 3 user ebook or a single print copy is just never going to be adequate to provide access for all the students who don't have their own copies. Nor does it provide them with access to the online ancillary materials that accompany many textbooks these days. But we hoped that some limited access would at least assist the students who had no other options, particularly those who reported that they had been seeking out a library copy when they couldn't purchase their own. The textbook program was actually a big success, and it's actually still in place today. We still purchase textbooks for most undergraduate courses, but it also created expectations as word got around that textbooks for most courses could be accessed through the library. And then in March 2020, our library closed, as did many others across North America in response to the global pandemic. Our textbook collection, which was primarily print, was inaccessible, of course, when the library was closed, and most classes had switched to remote delivery, so students weren't on campus. Instructors and students alike were demanding electronic access to their course textbooks. Some free access was made available by some publishers on a temporary basis, often through textbook platforms such as VitalSource and RedShelf. For example, students were in one case provided with free access for up to 7 textbook titles in return for signing on to the platform. But unfortunately, the free access was short-lived, and furthermore, it created expectations among both faculty and their students that all textbooks could be made available in electronic formats. So we found ourselves explaining repeatedly that we could not obtain ebook copies of most required textbooks. And in fact, in the fall 2020 semester, we calculated that only 15% of all of the required textbooks that were being used in University of Guelph courses at that time could be purchased by the library in electronic formats. This was really tough, though, to explain to our users who were well aware that there were ebook versions of most of these textbooks for sale to individuals through our university bookstore. So throughout the first few months of the pandemic, we worked to develop a coordinated library response to try and address the textbook crisis. We implemented a communication plan, new processes and workflows, all to try and address the need for ready access to course materials for remote learners. Our objectives were multiple. We wanted to clearly communicate the fact that it was not possible for the library to purchase ebook versions of textbooks in most cases and explain why. And in doing that, we also wanted to try and manage the expectations of both students and instructors with respect to online access. Additionally, we wanted to convey the range of supports that the library could make available to assist instructors with finding solutions to the problem. And we also hope to advocate for longer-term change by educating instructors about the problems that are inherent in commercial textbooks and by making them aware of the multiple alternatives that are available, including open alternatives. As I mentioned in an earlier slide, our response required collaboration across 2 different library teams and several units. And our communications team, which is not pictured on this particular slide, also assisted us with messaging at various times throughout the process. This slide outlines the respective roles of each of the teams or units involved. And we're going to explore the workflow of each of these in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. First, I want to talk a little bit about the course reserves workflow, which is where most of our communication with faculty kicked off. We really wanted to use existing communication channels, as well as processes that faculty were already familiar with. And as most of them submit course reserve materials each semester, that was a logical place for us to start. Each instructor was sent a customized email through our course reserve system, explaining why their textbook could not be made available and suggesting alternate options. Those alternate options included an offer to scan excerpts or a relevant chapter from their textbook or other books, subject to copyright guidelines, having one of our collection librarians source a relevant ebook that was not a textbook, and that would be something that was either already in our collection or that we were prepared to purchase for them. They could also have collections librarians identify other types of library licensed or open content that we could link to via course reserves, essentially creating an online course pack. And lastly, adopting an OER was presented as yet another potential solution. Initially, most instructors just wanted pages from their textbook scanned and posted. That seemed to them, I think, like the quickest and easiest solution. And we would try, the course reserves team would try to obtain permission and pay for permission to reproduce content for from the books that they want to have scanned. Most publishers, however, won't grant permission for more than a modest amount. Although in one instance, which I've included on this slide, we were quoted almost $14,000 for permission fees to scan and post 300 pages of a textbook. Needless to say, that wasn't an option. So in this case, we went with the instructor's second choice, which was to find an ebook that could be used as an alternative to the textbook. So in this case, we referred the instructor to a collections development librarian in order to source a suitable ebook. If the instructor had instead expressed interest in an open educational resource, we would have referred that instructor to the OER librarian. This slide outlines the workflow from the perspective of the OER librarian, who was Ali Versluis at the time. Instructors were referred to Ali either by the course reserves team or in some cases by a collections development librarian whenever they expressed interest in or made a commitment to adopting an OER for a course. If the instructor was referred from course reserves, The course reserve staff had actually been trained to perform a preliminary check for potential open educational resources in the relevant subject area, and they would forward that list on to the OER librarian when they made the referral. Ali would then assist the instructor with the evaluation and the selection of an appropriate OER, and would ensure that the instructor was made aware of the various supports that were available to help with the process of adopting and or adapting that resource for their course. The kind of supports that are offered include conducting accessibility audits, providing copyright and licensing guidance, access to Pressbook's open publishing software, instructional design expertise, and support for the use of educational technology. At this particular time, though, our focus was really on helping the instructor to find an existing OER that they could adopt and substitute in for their original textbook choice, rather than creating or even adapting an OER. This was because in most cases, instructors were making these decisions in the 11th hour and had neither the time nor energy to invest the amount of labor required to create an OER from scratch. However, several of the instructors that Ali worked with did commit to creating their own OER in future semesters, and some of them did go ahead and do that. In reality, most instructors who adopted an OER as a result of this particular process use the OER in combination with other resources or as a supplement to their existing textbook. I'm now going to hand things over to Meg, who's going to talk a little bit about the collections development workflow.
Okay, thanks, Heather. So picking up from Heather's outline of the workflow, what happens when a request for alternative course materials comes to the collections development team, which is my team? To operationalize this new service, we developed what we've called the textbook replacement recommendations workflow and checklist. And these documents outline the necessary work needed to provide the requesting instructor with a fulsome list of resources that could be used in combination as potential alternatives to a single commercial textbook. As we at Charleston know, collections librarians provide expertise with licensed library materials. So the ebooks, the streaming media collections, the primary source materials, the case collections, all the various types of content that make up our academic library collections and which don't cost students anything extra to access. So it was those licensed resources that comprise the world of affordable course materials. And those were the focus of this new workflow for our team. So to highlight how this checklist worked, I'll use a case study, which is a third year medical anthropology class that I helped to move away from a commercial textbook. I'll just note that if you're accessing our PowerPoint slides, I've made these files available on a publicly accessible Google Drive folder, so you can have a look at the checklist as a template, as well as this course example. So the medical anthropology course, this instructor got in touch because she found out from Heather's team that there was no library ebook access to her existing Wiley textbook. And she knew this would be a problem for students because she was going to be required to deliver this course online. The approach of the checklist is to provide a comprehensive list of the various resources that we've found and present them at the unit or the weekly level. So each week provides multiple resources that faculty can consider. They have a number of options for each unit or topical focus, and they can see clearly how these resources link back to their teaching goals week to week. The checklist allows the librarian, me, to move through the workflow step by step, outlining the various mix of resources to consider and how to investigate them. So what are these resources? The checklist does include searching in OER repositories, which we would also consult with the OER librarian about. It includes searching in our catalog of existing holdings to see if there's anything we already own that might fit. It includes searching in Gobi to identify potential ebook titles that we don't currently own, but which might be topically appropriate, that has preferable DRM or DRM-free access. And along with those kind of search strategies, I work closely with academic publishers by virtue of my job. And I know that a lot of academic publishers offer curriculum matching services or faculty support services to help mobilize their collections within courses, which is really good for them because it drives usage of their materials. But I worked in partnership with some of our larger academic publishers in order to utilize these services to source textbook alternatives. So that took a bit of the workload off of me. Those folks know their collections much better than I do, and they're able to recommend not just materials that we might already have in our entitlements, but also stuff that is outside of our collections, but which I can purchase as a one-off. Maybe they are DRM free. They might be other materials like case studies or videos, and they really help to enhance the recommendations list that I provide back to the prof. So in the end, this was a success, and we were able to flip this course over from a single commercial textbook to a collection of an ebook that I purchased to support this course, as well as several reference materials and book chapters and videos that one of our publisher partners had sourced. So she was able to move away from her Wiley textbook and supply students with these online materials instead. And in the course survey, the instructor asked her students, the course textbook and or readings contributed to my knowledge of the subject matter, to which 83% of students responded a great deal, and another 17% responded mostly. And she also shared a comment that a student left in their survey that I've excerpted here. The student said, personally, I love the idea of not having a standard textbook. Not only does it save students some money, but it also allows us the opportunity to see work from an array of different authors and perspectives. So I thought that was a really nice quote to read in response to this curriculum materials change. Now, the benefits and drawbacks of this type of service as I see it. So this is a novel service, and there's a lot of interesting ups and downs to promoting and collaborating with faculty members on this kind of curriculum recommendation service. The benefits are that it leverages subject expertise and collections roles in new ways. So for those of us who are subject librarians or collections or reference and instructional librarians, it utilizes our expertise in support of a new kind of service, and one that's a little bit different from our traditional service provisions. It spreads the responsibility for OER or OA beyond just your single ScholarComm librarian or OER librarian or your scholarly communications team. So it helps um, to bring the OA mandate or OER mandate that you might have in your library to some non-traditional teams, such as a collections team. And it helps carry the burden of that mandate across a broader swath of library workers. It provides a new mode of faculty outreach. So if you have faculty liaison as a part of your job responsibilities, it's another tool in your outreach tool belt. This is a kind of service that is useful. It helps faculty meet their teaching needs, and it also helps resolve a problem that they might be facing, especially in a pandemic or post-pandemic time. So it can be a really nice way to build new faculty relationships, to do outreach with faculty in your subject areas in a way that is sustainable and not overly arduous for anybody. It fills gaps among existing OER, especially for niche courses. So a course like medical anthropology just doesn't have a dedicated standalone OER that is going to meet all of the teaching needs of a faculty member. So where those gaps exist among the existing OER repositories, this kind of service can come in and fill that gap. And it's still getting faculty away from a single commercial textbook, even if it doesn't get them all the way to the adoption or adaption of an OER for their course. And lastly, it lowers the demand on faculty's time and labor. As Heather mentioned, our faculty were very burnt out and exhausted, and they were making these, were being forced to make these kinds of curriculum changes at the last minute because of the nature of the pandemic. So it takes some of that burden off of them. And I think by extension, it makes it a lot easier for them to buy into and take on these new readings without feeling like there's too much effort on their part. The drawbacks are that these readings are still usually supporting commercially licensed content and the imperfect access models that go along with it. We all know the trials and tribulations of especially our ebook holdings. So things like DRM limitations, limitations on the number of concurrent users that can access a particular ebook, which is especially difficult when something is being taken on for course adoption. There are still issues around cost and the pricing for some of these materials, and the access and accessibility issues that come with accessing your course materials through a proprietary ebook platform or a DRM aggregator platform. So those issues just become replicated through this kind of model. These materials are not adaptable by faculty to meet their local teaching needs. They are published copyrighted materials. They're in their final form. So they don't have the mutability or flexibility that an OER has. And honestly, there isn't widespread uptake among faculty. My office door is not being banged down with faculty members begging me to help move them away from commercial textbooks yet. Um, we are hoping to promote this service more widely to faculty this academic year to try and curry more interest. But as Heather and her team can attest, we're still putting a lot of traditional commercial print textbooks on course reserve. And lastly, access can still be unstable. So because it depends on library licensed materials, we still have the same kinds of access issues that our ebook collections often suffer. Some of our ebooks come to us through subscriptions, so access is transient or we don't have perpetual access rights. In other cases, publishers lose their distribution rights for materials, and so they are removed from our holdings. And as we know, publishers seem to sometimes remove content from our holdings without very much notice or rationale. So lately, some folks may be aware of the issue that academic libraries are facing with Wiley eBooks access, which is captured through a couple of tweets from Twitter, as well as this Inside Higher Ed article that highlighted the issue that Wiley had taken out access to over 1,300 titles from their ebook subscription practices. And many of us know this is not a new practice, as titles are regularly removed from packages. But this particular case received a lot of attention because the titles in question were really popular ones that had heavy usage. And they were clearly being used as course materials, but they were taken out just as the fall semester was starting. So it created a lot of chaos for libraries and instructors who are using them in their courses. And this kind of issue is replicated when we depend on affordable or library licensed course materials rather than going with something more sustainable and more accessible like OER. Moving away from our workflows, we also engaged with some library advocacy initiatives during the pandemic. Heather alluded to these, and I've linked them here if you'd like to have a look. The first is a library news article from our website called Commercial Textbooks Present Challenges in a Virtual Environment. And the other is a white paper that we collaborated on with CARL, the Canadian Association of Research Libraries, called Equitable Affordable Access to Digital Course Materials for University Students, Issues and Solutions. So the library news article was published ahead of the fall 2020 semester. Heather mentioned this particular communications effort. This was an article that we published on our website to alert faculty to the practical challenges that we were facing in sourcing online textbooks during the pandemic due to a lack of purchase options and unrealistic pricing for course materials. It was sort of notable because we did choose to name names, going so far as to call out the specific publishers that we were really struggling with in terms of content and access. And although it was intended as a communication strategy geared towards our faculty, sort of internal to our institution, much to our surprise and delight, it kind of exploded. Like it was adopted by many academic libraries throughout North America and the UK. And it became a really meaningful rallying cry for librarians who were all struggling with the same challenges on their own local campuses. So it became a unified messaging geared towards faculty across all of our institutions. And it became a useful point of advocacy when we were all struggling with the same publisher challenges while our campuses were in various stages of closure. So since 2020, we have been contacted by over 200 librarians to provide kudos or request adoption of this article for their own communications. And our communications team has told us that it is the second most viewed news story ever on our library website. And riding the wave of that success with that library news article, we also worked with our national association that represents research libraries. I think pretty much every university library in Canada is represented by Carl. And we worked with members of their staff on to collaborate on the writing of a white paper, an open letter that called out publisher profiteering during the pandemic and how their business decisions had made it really impossible for academic libraries to properly acquire and make accessible the curriculum materials that students required for their coursework. Carl lobbies our government officials, so they have close relationships with our various ministries in our national capital in Ottawa. They work closely with government officials and parliamentarians to draft legislative changes that benefit academic libraries. So we published this as an advocacy tool that called on textbook publishers to allow sales of e-textbooks to libraries, make pricing and availability of e-textbooks reasonable, stable, and transparent. So this was a time when titles were appearing and disappearing in our monograph acquisitions platforms. We use Gobi really quickly, or we were losing country level licensing rights for materials that were specifically beneficial to Canadian students, or we were just seeing pricing that was all over the map. I have never seen a five-figure price for a single ebook purchase in Gobi until the pandemic. So that was making it really difficult for us to make purchase decisions and make sustainable costing decisions for our collections. And lastly, we call on publishers to remove DRM. All of our students were learning remotely. All of them had to access their course materials while they had no access to the library's print collections. So the DRM was making it extremely difficult and causing them a lot of consternation. So today, broadly, we have seen a change in the winds on our campus. We've seen a shift from the promotion of OER to real action on OER. So generally, we think that we're answering the question, what are OER? Much less. and instead answering the question, how? How can they be adapted and taken on at the University of Guelph? I want to give a shout out to a recently hired librarian on our team, Alexandra Marcascio. She was hired as a backfill for Ali's role when Ali moved into the head of research and scholarship position. So Alexandra is our recently hired OER librarian, and in her short time with us so far, she has taken on a number of OER initiatives that are really impressive in their initiative and their scope. So in terms of helping us to build out OER infrastructure, she's built out a number of LibGuides to support the use of open and affordable course contents across disciplines and resource types. This is helping to enhance other OER infrastructure that we've been working on, such as a local instance of Pressbooks, an OER grant to buy out faculty who want to take a course release in order to develop their own OER, as well as a number of other initiatives to make OER more discoverable and more accessible for our instructors. Alexandra is also working to craft a library statement opposing the use of commercial textbooks. So this is to enhance our other advocacy efforts by really speaking out against the use of commercial textbooks as course materials on our campus, which we aim to have endorsed by library senior leadership and made available on our website. And she's also spearheading a curriculum mapping project to identify where course syllabi require commercial textbook purchases, as well as what are called non-textbook costed materials, which are things like software that are required to purchase in order to access assessment mechanisms like quizzes or test question banks, that sort of thing. So she's really helping to build out the OER related data that we have accessible to us so that we can understand what's going on our campus and be able to respond with services or other communications or advocacy campaigns. So broadly, we've seen a much clearer political orientation towards OER across our campus. We have a provost statement from our provost who has come out in support of OER use. Our Office of Teaching and Learning has become a really crucial partner in OER. So they are bringing conversations around OER into their course redesign institute. OER is mentioned in our campus's teaching and learning strategic plan. We have many more faculty coming to us who are interested in OER. They are interested in serving on that task force that Heather mentioned, the Open and Affordable Course Content Task Force. There's more interest in the OER grant program, and there's better attendance at OER workshops. Students are wonderful advocates for OER. The Student Union on campus is also a member of the Open and Affordable Course Content Task Force, and they have recently integrated OER into the criteria for their teaching awards. And among our library leadership, we are lucky to have two AULs who both have spent chapters of their career in the past as ScholComm librarians. So they have that natural open orientation as they've moved into library leadership roles. And that we see there being a greater willingness among our library management team to support and resource this kind of work more effectively. We had the OER role backfilled when Ali moved into her new position. So we see more continuity and more support at the senior decision maker level within our library. And I'll hand it back over to Heather for more thoughts.
Thanks, Meg. So a few more things that are also happening today. Physical access, thank goodness, is a little bit less complicated than it was during the pandemic. And as I mentioned, we still acquire and make available textbooks for as many courses on campus as we can. But there are still some issues with print textbooks as well. Not to mention the demand for ebook access is still there. It has not gone away at all. And we continue to be unable to purchase library copies of textbooks in e-formats. So we're still dealing with that particular challenge. Our data for this year so far indicates that 76% of required textbooks at Guelph are unavailable for us to purchase as ebooks in any given semester. And if we look specifically at the traditional textbook publishers, 93% of them are unavailable in electronic formats. Even print copies are becoming difficult to get, as some textbook publishers are no longer producing them or are only producing loose leaf versions, which are really not very helpful for placing on course reserve. And any ebooks that we are able to obtain now tend to have single user licenses, as Meg has mentioned, which make them impractical to use as required course readings, as well as increasingly restrictive limits on the amounts of a work that can be copied or printed by students. We do have a positive trend, though, in that we are tracking the use of OER in courses and have seen those numbers go up. In 2019, we actually didn't know of a single course that was using an OER. By 2020, we had 15 OERs in use, and last year, 2021, there were 21 courses using an open educational resource of some kind as their primary course resource. And in general, as Meg has said, we're noticing just a much more widespread awareness of the access issues that commercial textbooks create. And when faculty raise those issues, that gives us an opportunity to start the conversation about open alternatives. Future directions. Where do we go from here? Well, we certainly have plans to continue the work that we've been doing all along, because it feels like as hard as that work was and as unrewarding as it was in the beginning, we are finally starting to see it pay off. We've continued to be transparent with our users about the ongoing ebook challenges that we face. And we have placed an ebook FAQ on our website that deals with the problems of ebook availability, access, and licensing limitations. We also plan to highlight and start some discussions around some of the problematic institutional policies that exist, such as the ancillary fees policy, which outlines the additional fees that students can be required to pay over and above their tuition fees. The policy in use at Guelph is outdated, and it really doesn't reflect the many new costs that students are being required to pay as a result of new classroom technologies, for example. We also recognize the challenges that we're going to continue to face going forward, whether they be publisher business models, the growth of online learning platforms like Perusal or Top Hat that are offering prepackaged courses, making textbook purchasing a requirement of student participation. And beyond that, just the ongoing fallout from the pandemic that continues to be disruptive, whether it be because of increasing costs, supply chain issues, budget constraints, and once again, tired and overworked faculty. We do feel strongly, though, that libraries and library staff need to be political and forthright about the problematic access arrangements that we're dealing with and how they are impacting our user community. It's essential that we continue to challenge current business models and advocate for a fairer deal if we're going to see any meaningful change going forward.
All right, that wraps up our presentation. Thank you for your interest and attention. We hope it was informative. And if you have any questions, feel free to get in touch. On behalf of Heather, Ali, and myself, we appreciate your time and we hope to hear from you in the live Q&A at Charleston. Thank you.